The Cold War was not a direct military conflict, but a long period of tension and competition between two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, after World War II. It lasted from around 1947 to 1991, and shaped much of global history during the 20th century. On one side you had the United States, leading the Western Bloc, promoting democracy and capitalism. On the other, the Soviet Union, leading the Eastern Bloc, advocating for communism. Early Cold War, the 1940s to the 1950s. After World War II, Europe was in ruins, and the United States and the Soviet Union both wanted to shape the future of the continent. One of the first major events was the division of Germany. Berlin, the capital, was split into East and West, symbolizing the division of the world. In 1948, the Soviet Union tried to cut off West Berlin in the Berlin blockade, but the United States responded with the Berlin airlift, flying in supplies to keep the city going. Nuclear arms race and space race, the 1950s to the 1960s. Both sides built huge arsenals of nuclear weapons, creating fear of total destruction. This was called mutually assured destruction, or MAD. At the same time they competed in space, with the Soviets launching the first satellite, Sputnik, in 1957, and the United States landing the first man on the moon in 1969. There were moments when the Cold War almost turned hot. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 was one of the closest calls. The Soviets placed nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from the United States. After tense negotiations, both sides backed down, narrowly avoiding war. Cold War conflicts from the 1950s to the 1970s. Even though the United States and the Soviet Union didn't fight each other directly, they supported opposing sides in conflicts around the world. In the Korean War, from 1950 to 1953, and the Vietnam War, from 1955 to 1975, the United States fought to stop the spread of communism, while the Soviets and their allies supported communist forces. Détente and final years, from the 1970s to 1991. The 1970s saw a period of détente, or easing of tensions, between the superpowers. Treaties like the SALT agreements were signed to limit nuclear weapons, and diplomacy seemed to be working. However, the Cold War flared up again in the 1980s with President Ronald Reagan ramping up military spending and calling the Soviet Union the evil empire. But by the late 1980s, the Soviet economy was struggling. Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev introduced reforms known as perestroika, which were economic reforms, and glasnost, meaning openness, to save the system, but it wasn't enough. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell, signaling the end of Soviet control in Eastern Europe. By 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved, marking the official end of the Cold War.